Welcome to today's episode of the podcast. Today we are joined by Andrea Ribeiro Hoffmann, a leading voice in international relations and a passionate advocate for addressing the global climate crisis. Andrea is an associate professor at the Institute of International Relations at the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, and a collaborator professor at the Federal University of Latin American Integration. As a visiting research fellow at UNASUR, working on green politics and policies in the EU and Latin American regional organisations, her work bridges academic excellence and practical solutions to pressing global challenges. Today we're discussing her chapter titled Climate Change in Regional Perspective, European Union and Latin American Initiatives, Challenges and Solutions, which is part of a book Andrea co-edited, published in 2024 as an initiative of the Jean Monnet Network, Crisis, Equity, Democracy for Europe and Latin America, or the JMN. And the best part is that it's open sourced for everyone to read. We'll make sure that we put a link to both the chapter and the book in the description of this podcast. So please go ahead and check it out after this. So get ready for a conversation packed with expertise and inspiration for actionable ideas. So welcome to the show, Andrea.
Thank you very much. I'm really glad to contribute to the podcast of the U Value, which is a research network that I've been collaborating.
Great to have you. Great to have you on the show indeed. Let's dive right in. In your chapter, you talk of actions or perhaps inactions of Latin American regional organizations like MERCOSUR, UNASUR, and others. Can you start by telling us about why these organizations have struggled to make climate change a priority, despite the region's environmental importance and its vulnerabilities?
Yes, well, in this research, exactly, I was trying to find out what these organizations did in the area of climate change and exactly why they did or did not. One of the conclusions was exactly that they didn't do much, despite the fact that the countries, the member states, they actually did a lot. Sometimes, no, it varies over time and over country, but most of the countries, they did a lot domestically and also globally. So the question, right, why at the regional level there is not so much? I draw, of course, in some arguments by historical institutionalism, and that most of these organizations, they were created in particular points of time where some of them, the main focus were the liberalization of trade, for instance. Others, they had other concepts of development, including the development of infrastructure or even the free trade aspect that didn't favor like a strong commitments in climate change. With time, some of them, because of the agendas of member states, they started including commitments, but because of the initial design and agendas of these organizations, they favored other topics, such again, trade liberalization or investments out of infrastructure. And they didn't have strong commitments on issues related to climate change, such as human rights related to indigenous populations or even like issues of adaptation. It was not really in their agendas. So they ended up have very thin commitments. In addition to this kind of path dependencies of the organizations, what I found out is that from the literature, most of research about climate change points to the importance of so-called epistemic communities, like groups that are constituted, including, for instance, experts, academics, but also political actors, social movement actors, but they share some hardcore consensus on the scientific knowledge that's produced, indicating exactly the problems of climate change. And what I found out is that in Latin America, such epistemic communities, they were either non-existent or they focus the global level or not really the regional level. In the region, most of these countries export agriculture commodities. Therefore, they're very strongly constituted also historically lobbies for the agribusiness. And this has been one of the main lobbies against strong commitments in climate change.
Yeah, you mentioned there the particular time or period in history in which some of these organizations were created, how that's affected their commitment to climate change. Could you talk to us a little about how political changes, such as the shift from the pink tide to more conservative governments, have impacted climate cooperation in the region? For our listeners, by pink tide, we're referring to the phenomenon in Latin America in the late 1990s and early 2000s, where we saw a rise of leftist and centre-left governments, and so a move away from neoliberal economic policies.
Right. So as I mentioned, some of these organizations during the pink tide, they did a lot in development, but not necessarily as with the concept of a sustainable development being implemented. So even if there are a lot of positive commitments to social policies, generally speaking, or cooperation among governments of the pink tide, that was not their strongest element. We had in the end of the 2000s some change of governments to neoliberal governments, which reinforced free trade. But in some organizations already, because of the timing, the topic of climate change was already much more present, and there was also much more demand that these were being included in the regional level. So these came to enter, for instance, the agenda of CELAC, but also the agenda of PROSUR. However, we had also not only more conservative in the sense of economic policy, but also the accession of populist right government, for instance, in Brazil, and later in Argentina. But in that particular brand of conservative governments, in the case of Bolsonaro, but also governments like Trump in the US, they had an attitude of climate negationism. So not only spreading fake news and their own rhetorics, but in the case of Brazil, really dismantling domestic politics in that regard. All the norms and policies, but also politically disempowered. And this kind of government empowered, on the contrary, exactly the agribusiness sector. They wanted basically to increase exports. The model of development was not anymore developmentalist, but rather just increasing commodities exports. So this combination of free trade based on the exports of commodities and climate negationism was really bad for the region. Of course, that was a more radical position of the Brazilian government. But Brazil is a big country, especially in South America, and had always been in its foreign policy engaged with the regional organizations and had attempted to foster these organizations and to exert leadership. So that also ended up weakening even further commitments of climate change in the regional organizations.
So we've seen that shift then towards conservative politics and a push towards increasing agribusinesses and exports. What then are the biggest institutional challenges today that these organizations are facing in enforcing climate policies? And maybe it's not too much, how can we address those?
Oh, that's a difficult one because at the institutional level, so to speak, regional organizations in Latin America, they are not supranational. So in that sense, they lack technical staff, civil servants who keep a certain continuity in terms of commitments. But also, I mean, it doesn't have to be supranational. As I mentioned, these epistemic communities, they want to foster change. So they try to influence policy making at the domestic, at the global, and then at the regional level. And in the case of Latin America, these institutions, they are too weak. So because of the ideological polarization of governments at the domestic level in Latin America at the moment, this constantly change of governments make it harder for this agreed consensus to be transferred to more effective policies or projects at the regional level. This continuity or this agenda that they can have despite this change of governments into this very kind of radical changes from the left to the far right, and in some other governments that continued until today.
It's a good point, like the lack of resources such as technical staff, and as you say, coupled then with the kind of constant change of government in the region, it seems very difficult to be effective at that level. Thinking in the global arena, how do you think Latin America could leverage its participation when we have, say, global frameworks like the Paris Agreement to strengthen regional climate action?
Latin American countries have actually participated, even Brazil, despite the government of Bolsonaro, in those negotiations. If you think about the Rio 92, it was in Brazil. And because of the biomas in the area, including certainly the Amazon basin, the Amazon countries, they have been actually engaging and committed. And so the question is how the regional level can strengthen the implementation of those commitments. Because the global level commitments, they are most of them soft power or soft laws. So the governments, they commit, but that's not necessarily translated. From the Paris Agreement, the national determined countries measures, they are implemented domestically, but otherwise, most of the other commitments, they hang in the air, so to speak. So the idea is that the regional level could contribute to this enforcement and implementation, to the extent that some of these organizations, they can also mobilize other resources they have from regional development banks that could be canalized through these organizations in projects, or they have also transversal policies such as trade policies. If they include climate change conditionalities, for instance, of trade liberalization, this can be much more effective. Some, especially the regional organizations who have trade mandates to negotiate free trades. And that's exactly the case of the EU-MERCOSUR agreement, which I think we'll talk about later.
Well, I think that's really great to hear that these organizations do have the power and the resources to mobilize action, and that could come from such agreements. And yeah, we will come to the EU-MERCOSUR agreement, I imagine, in a moment. I wanted to very briefly touch on the COP conferences. That's the United Nations climate change conferences that happen every year. It just took place in November 2024 in Azerbaijan. And of course, this year in 2025, it will be in Brazil. So, well, first, do you have any takeaways actually from the COP29? And as a Brazilian yourself, what are your thoughts on the COP30 being hosted by Brazil this year? Like, do you feel like it might have any impact on the inclusion of climate action in trade mandates or otherwise?
So I think one of the controversial points in the last COPs, well, there's several, but I would highlight two. One is what we can see as a renewed interest in fossil fuels. And that's a question for, as I mentioned, Latin American countries. They are exporters of commodities, including not only agriculture, but also even oil. That has been a problem, this contamination of the lobbies and the industries of oil that have been attempting to use space of COPs. So we hear about even trade deals being done in the parallel events. And here, Latin American countries are not very consistent. Even the Lula's government in Brazil, it has on one hand leadership in climate change, and definitely from the point of view of engagement of the responsible ministries, they are doing a lot. But at the same time, there is no policy to stop, for instance, the production of oil, or powerful lobbies who continue parallelly. And that's the case in many countries, and that's one of the problems that we are seeing in the last COPs. Another issue that appears always from the beginning in the COPs and affects also Latin American regionalism and the capacity to face climate change is the question of climate change initiative financing. And during the COPs, all the efforts to commitments of resources have been also always undermined. The expectations have never been met. Behind that, there is, on one hand, this cleavage that from the beginning of this regime of climate change, where there's a claim based on the common but differentiated responsibilities, countries from the north and countries from the south, so to speak, that of course now some countries who are developing, they have to do, and that's good, of course, those transformation to make their energy production clean and so on. Or to protect their forests, but countries who developed it before that, they didn't. So on the climate finance, there is this idea of climate justice, that countries who already devastated their forests or already contributed to emissions in the past where those constraints were not there, they should then transfer resources to the countries where that took place later or are taking place now. In Latin America, we have also a lot of contradictions that even in countries where you have domestic policies, you can think about Chile or Uruguay. I mean, some countries have been reaching their targets and being quite advanced. However, we have also this climate justice in the sense of one of the problems in Latin America is that we do have indigenous but also traditional populations living in a lot of these biomes, and historically they have not been consulted either when there are projects going on. It's a big question in the Latin American region organizations, and that's dealt also at COP, how you can provide climate justice among countries, but also within the countries. How, when you are talking about sustainable development projects in biomes, how to incorporate the local populations in those projects to assure that they have also not only dignity life and access also to the resources where they live, but also their cultural identities can be fostered. So these issues have been discussed in COP and they are very controversial, and normally you don't have then a translation of this to the regional level. this renewed leadership by the Brazilian government since 2023 has been targeting the COP30 that will be held in Belém, the north of Brazil, in the Amazon. So it will be, I think, a very special COP because it is literally in the forest, and I think it would be not only symbolically, but hopefully people who will be there in person will be able to feel a bit the dimension of the forest. That will be, I think, a strong moment where renewed leadership in the region can bring some contribution to the global level commitments.
Yeah, I really hope so. Okay, a big question for you now. In your opinion, what would a truly effective and unified climate strategy for Latin America look like? And which organization do you feel is best positioned to lead this effort?
That's also a very difficult question.
Sorry.
And I think one of the findings or one of the elements that I have highlighted in this research is that maybe there's no single organization that's really the best in that sense, because these organizations, they work great in different times with different mandates. Some have trade liberalization, some not. So they have a different ability to incorporate these agendas. And one of the organizations that I have been focusing more recently that was not even properly covered in the book chapter, but it's being covered in my current research, is the Amazon Cooperation Treaty Organization. So this is an organization that covers only the biome of the Amazon forest. But for this region, I think this could be an organization that could be more effective because, first of all, it includes all the countries, but that have a direct interest on that biome. But also it foresees dialogue with the population. So there is the so-called Amazon dialogues, and it has been active. And this organization has stronger, I would say, relation with the technical level of some aspects of climate change. For instance, in the case of adaptation to droughts and fires and water resources. I mean, so there has been more cooperation among the technical level of the member states to collaborate when facing those, so to speak, disasters. So it has been less politicized, I would say, from this polarization that we are talking about. It seems there is more actors that share this consensus about the knowledge of the problem and involves also practical solutions. So there's another organization or institution that I want to call attention, which is the Escazú Agreement. So this is a regional agreement fostered in the context of ECLAC, the Economic Commission for Latin America from the UN, United Nations. And this agreement, it's called actually Access to Information, Public Participation and Justice Environmental Matters in Latin America and the Caribbean. It was concluded recently, 2018. And I think it's very important because it seeks to, first of all, as the title of the agreement says, to increase awareness about this problem, so that all governments, also local governments, and not only federal governments, they try to include climate change agenda in that programs, but also the civil society. As we mentioned, especially in the context of climate negationism, there's a lot of fake news about climate change, about what's causing climate change. And I think this agreement seeks to empower those actors, providing knowledge about what is known. Of course, there's a lot of unknowns and uncertainties, but exactly to bring that to the public. And at the same time, also to provide protection to climate change and human rights defenders, because Latin America is the region where we have more assassinations of environmental defenders. In the Amazon, for instance, Colombia is the first country and Brazil is the second. It's an average of more than 40 people per year. And these 40 people per year, they are leaders. It's leadership on the ground that try to make a change. So they are pretty much on the eyes of those powerful lobbies, because we have, in addition to the agriculture, oil, of course, we have also a lot of illegal activities. So there's a lot of illegal mining, and those actors, they have no barriers. So if you are in the middle of the forest, And you have some activists who are trying to go against, for instance, illegal mining, which is very common in the Amazon. They are simply killed. And this agreement brings then a human rights perspective, and that the assassinations, they are prosecuted. They make cases in the local or regional courts, and this is also disseminated. So the idea is that if those cases are brought to the judicial systems, and if there's information about people who were caught, who were in prison, that discourages those illegal groups to simply assassinating, thinking that this won't bring any consequences to them.
Interesting. Yeah. Super, super important. I agree to include civil society actors in all of this. I am just looking up now both the Escazú Agreement, if I pronounce that correctly, and the Amazon Cooperation Treaty Organization, or ACTO, as you've referenced. I will make sure to put both of those in the description of this podcast for any listeners that would like to check them out a little bit more for the great reasons Andrea has just mentioned. So, what role do you see for regional cooperation, particularly between the EU and Latin America, in advancing climate action on a global scale? And what practical steps are needed that currently hinder this partnership?
Yeah, so that's also, if we look at those two parts of the partnership, as we saw, like in Latin America, of course, the domestic level, some countries are doing a lot, and they collaborate bilaterally. But if you think about the interregional dialogues and agreements and cooperation, that has been then less present, as I mentioned, because in the case of Latin American organizations, this is a topic that was not frontlined. So what I think in the case of EU-CELAC, for instance, dialogue, it has been more and more included, but again, CELAC is an organization which is basically foster consensus, but it doesn't create norms or projects. So it goes back to the national level most of the time. So if we think about the bilateral partnerships, for instance, in the case of Brazil, this has been, as the other dialogues, they have been reactivated recently. So that's a good space to discuss. So on the EU side, I mean, the topic of climate change enters directly in the bilateral or bi-regional trade agreements. And here I think there's a space for cooperation in the sense of reaching out consensus about how this could be included. In the case of the EU-MERCOSUR agreement, for instance, this agreement has been negotiated for over 20 years, and it was concluded in 2019. However, at that time, in the case of Brazil, it was during Bolsonaro, and it was, as I mentioned, climate negationist. And for these and other reasons, the agreement was on the EU side also not ratified. So this agreement was recently, now in 2025, concluded again. And there we can see how climate change can be included, because it is included not only in the sense, which is very important, of a value of the organization, but it can also be included in the economic, like trade commitments. And here, one of the elements that the agreement brings from a positive point of view is to multilateralize, or to bring to the cooperation some controversial regulations that were issued by the EU in the context of the EU Green Deal, which have extraterritorial effect. So we have the CBAM and the UDR, for instance, who are regulations which are aimed to control, to put down carbon emissions, and also to deforestation, which is very good. But since they are domestic regulations, they are, of course, democratically decided in the EU, but they have extraterritorial effects. So there has been a lot of resistance on third countries that in the end were not included in the negotiations, debates about those regulations. And so by concluding the agreement, you open also a channel of dialogue and negotiations about how those aims, which are to reduce carbon emissions and also deforestation, can be implemented, in which pace, under which conditions, and how the costs attributed to the implementation of the regulations can be compensated. As I mentioned, of course, at the global level, there is discussion about a division costs between North and South countries. So by including the commitments in the agreements, there is a space to multilaterally negotiate and think about those effects and the necessity also adaptations that must be done in terms of the costs. So this is a very positive element, for instance. And on the other hand, also in the cooperation, there are a lot of projects, cooperation in the level of implementation of sustainable development projects. And the EU, for instance, collaborate with the so-called Amazon Fund, which was suspended during Bolsonaro government, but was rehabilitated. And so these funds, they go to the local level projects from the cities, but also from civil society to foster sustainable development, use of forests, for instance. And then there's a lot of horizontal projects among the EU and Latin American countries, such as the Alinvest Verde, Aloclima, Amazon Plus. So there are a lot of possibilities to foster those local level projects. So this is less about the meeting targets, which is, of course, better dealt at the federal level, but these are projects at the local level, which can be done with cities and with civil societies, and covering all elements of climate change, not only energy, but also use of forest and including, which is very important, in the local population.
Yes, a super interesting time to be talking to you, actually, considering the agreement with MERCOSUR was agreed, not ratified, but agreed so recently, December the 6th, for any listeners who would like to look into that a little bit more. This brings us to the end of today's episode. Thank you very much for sharing your time and expertise with us and the EU Values Network, Andrea.
Thank you very much.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. Do be sure to download the book, which will be in the description of this podcast, and let us know what you thought of this episode, either in the comments on whatever platform you're listening to us on, or by subscribing, following us, helping us reach more people. Until next time, stay informed, take care, and hear from you soon.